In the spring of 1941, the outcome of the war at sea hung in the balance. The United Kingdom stood as the sole major power resisting Nazi Germany in Europe. The survival of the British war effort depended entirely on the merchant convoys travelling from North America. These ships carried the fuel for the Royal Air Force, the food for the civilian population, and the raw materials for industry. The German Naval High Command intended to sever this lifeline. While U-boat submarines were the most persistent threat, the prospect of heavy surface ships breaking into the Atlantic caused the most anxiety in London. A single powerful warship operating freely against convoy lanes could destroy dozens of merchant vessels in a short time and disappear before escorts could react. The instrument chosen to execute this blow was the battleship Bismarck. Commissioned in August 1940, she represented the pinnacle of German naval engineering. Displacing over 50,000 tons fully loaded, she was heavily armoured and armed with 8 15-inch guns arranged in 4 twin turrets. She possessed a top speed of 30 knots, making her faster than the older British battleships that might try to catch her. Accompanying her was the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, a new vessel displacing 14,000 tons and capable of similar speeds. The mission was designated Operation Rheinbung. The command fell to Admiral Günther Lütjens, a serious and experienced officer who had successfully disrupted Allied shipping earlier in the war using the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Lütjens received strict tactical orders for this new sortie. His primary objective was the destruction of merchant shipping. He was explicitly ordered to avoid engagements with British capital ships unless absolutely necessary to preserve his own vessels. The plan relied on the Bismarck engaging the convoy escorts to draw their fire, leaving the Prince Eugen free to hunt the defenseless transport ships. On the night of May 18, 1941, the two ships prepared to depart from the port of Gdynia in occupied Poland. The operation required secrecy to succeed. If the Royal Navy detected the squadron before it could break out into the open Atlantic, the British Home Fleet would concentrate overwhelming force against them. Lütjens intended to navigate through the Kattegat and Skagerrak Straits, move up the coast of Norway, and then dash through the Denmark Strait, the frigid stretch of water separating Iceland and Greenland. For the British Admiralty, the escape of the Bismarck was a worst-case scenario. Admiral John Tovey, the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, kept his ships at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands on high alert. He knew that if the German giant managed to reach the shipping lanes, the convoy system might become untenable, forcing Britain to suspend imports and facing the prospect of starvation. The ensuing operation to track and destroy the German flagship would become one of the most complex naval endeavours of the Second World War, spanning thousands of square miles of ocean. However, before the British could hunt the Bismarck, they first had to find her. Part 1. Detection in the Mist. The first sign that the German surface fleet was on the move came from a chance encounter in the Baltic Sea. On May 20, 1941, the Swedish aircraft cruiser Gotland was conducting routine exercises when her crew spotted 2 large warships accompanied by destroyers and aircraft moving northwest. The vessels were the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen. Sweden was neutral, but the sight of such a significant German force moving toward the North Sea was a matter of immediate concern for their naval command. Captain Agron of the Gotland transmitted a routine sighting report to his headquarters in Stockholm. The information was processed in the normal course of Swedish naval operations, where it eventually crossed the desk of Colonel Roger Lund, the Norwegian military attaché in Stockholm. Lund, whose country was occupied by German forces, maintained a covert friendship with his British counterpart, Captain Henry Denham. Lund passed the intelligence to Denham, who immediately recognized the significance of the report. He hurriedly encrypted a message to the British Admiralty in London. The message stated simply that 2 heavy German warships had been seen passing the Kattegat to the northwest. This wire was the first warning bell. Simultaneously, agents of the Norwegian resistance were monitoring the coastline. When the German flotilla anchored briefly near Kristiansand to refuel, resistance members Viggo Axelsson and Håk Sannes observed the ships. They sketched the silhouettes and identified the distinct profile of a Bismarck-class battleship. They smuggled this information to a radio transmitter, sending a confirmation that matched Captain Denham's report. In London, the Admiralty operations room grew tense. If the Bismarck was in the North Sea, a breakout attempt was imminent. However, Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, needed visual confirmation before deploying his capital ships. He could not risk sending the fleet in the wrong direction based on second-hand reports. On May 21st, a Spitfire reconnaissance pilot named Michael Suckling was dispatched to scour the Norwegian coast. Flying at 25,000 feet to avoid anti-aircraft fire, Suckling located two large vessels anchored in Grimstadfjord, near Bergen. He managed to snap a series of high-altitude photographs before turning back to Scotland. When the analysis team examined the grain of the photographs, the identity of the ships was undeniable. One was a Hipper-class cruiser, the Prinz Eugen. The other was the Bismarck. Tovey now had his confirmation. He immediately issued orders to maximize the readiness of the fleet. The cruisers, HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk, already patrolling the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, were ordered to exercise extreme vigilance. These two cruisers were the eyes of the fleet, the tripwire that Tovey relied upon to catch the Germans before they could disappear into the vastness of the Atlantic. However, the British lost contact the following day. On May 22nd, the weather over the Norwegian coast deteriorated, grounding further reconnaissance flights. When a naval aircraft finally managed to penetrate the gloom and fly over Grimstadfjord, the pilot reported that the anchorage was empty. The German ships had used the poor weather as cover to slip away. Tovey received the signal. The bird has flown. The hunt was now active, but the ocean was vast. Tovey had to guess Lütjens' route. The German admiral had two primary choices to enter the Atlantic. He could pass south of Iceland, through the gap between the Faroe Islands and Iceland, or he could take the northern route through the Denmark Strait. Tovey covered his bets. He deployed the main body of the home fleet, including his flagship HMS King George V, the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious, and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, to cover the southern approaches. To the west, he dispatched his most powerful fighting unit, the battlecruiser HMS Hood, along with the brand-new battleship HMS Prince of Wales, under the command of Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland. Their orders were to patrol south of Iceland, ready to sprint north if the cruisers in the Denmark Strait made contact. The Denmark Strait is a treacherous stretch of water. While the distance between Iceland and Greenland looks wide on a map, the navigable channel in 1941 was significantly narrower. The polarity of the season meant that the edge of the Arctic ice pack extended far to the south, choking the strait. To make matters worse, the British had laid extensive minefields off the northwest coast of Iceland. These two barriers, the ice to the west and the mines to the east, created a bottleneck roughly 60 miles wide. It was through this funnel that Lütjens would have to pass. On the evening of May 23rd, the conditions in the Denmark Strait were appalling, typical for the latitude. Mist and fog patches reduced visibility to a few miles, and snow squalls frequently zeroed it out completely. The sea was rough and the air was freezing. Patrolling this sector were the heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk. The Norfolk was the flagship of Rear Admiral Frederick Wake Walker, commanding the cruiser squadron. The HMS Suffolk, commanded by Captain Robert Ellis, had a distinct advantage. She had been recently refitted with a Type 284 radar set. In 1941, ship-borne radar was still a developing technology, and few ships possessed reliable sets. The Suffolk's radar allowed her to see through the fog and snow, detecting surface ships up to 13 miles away. Captain Ellis knew that visual lookouts would be almost useless in the driving snow, so he relied heavily on his radar operators. He positioned the Suffolk near the edge of the ice pack on the western side of the strait, scanning the gloom. At 7:22 in the evening, able seaman Newell, a lookout on the starboard bridge of the Suffolk, spotted something despite the mist. He called out, "Ship bearing green 140. Captain Ellis and his bridge crew peered into the haze. At first they thought it might be the HMS Hood arriving early, but the silhouette was wrong. As the mist cleared momentarily, the distinctive outline of the Bismarck became visible, followed closely by the Prinz Eugen. They were less than 7 miles away, dangerously close for a heavy cruiser facing a battleship. Captain Ellis immediately ordered the wheel hard over. His priority was to maintain contact without being destroyed. Ellis steered the Suffolk into the fog, hiding his ship from the German optical rangefinders while keeping his radar fixed on the enemy. He signaled the sighting report that electrified the Atlantic fleet. Enemy in sight. Admiral Lütjens, aboard the Bismarck, was now aware he had been spotted. The German hydrophones had picked up the sound of the British cruiser's propellers, and the Bismarck's own radar detectors had intercepted the pulse of the Suffolk's radar. Lütjens knew his hope for a secret breakout was gone. He was being shadowed. Hearing the Suffolk's report, Rear Admiral Wake Walker on the HMS Norfolk ordered his ship to close the distance at full speed. The Norfolk was roughly 15 miles away in the mist. Wake Walker needed to confirm the sighting and join the Suffolk in the shadowing effort. However, the Norfolk lacked the advanced surface search radar of her sister ship. She was charging blind into the fog bank. At 8:30 p.m., the Norfolk emerged from a thick patch of mist. To the horror of the bridge crew, they found themselves on a collision course with the German column. The Bismarck was only 6 miles away, looming out of the grey water. The German lookouts spotted the British cruiser instantly. The Bismarck's massive turrets swung around. Within seconds, the Bismarck opened fire. 5 15-inch shells, each weighing nearly a ton, roared toward the Norfolk. The salvos straddled the cruiser, throwing out geysers of water high above the bridge and showering the decks with splinters. It was a miracle the ship was not hit directly. Captain Phillips of the Norfolk ordered an emergency turn to port, ordering the deployment of a smokescreen. The cruiser heeled over sharply, retreating back into the safety of the mist as further shells landed in her wake. This brief, violent encounter had a significant unforeseen consequence for the German operation. The blast pressure from the Bismarck's own forward guns was so intense that it disabled the ship's forward radar set. The vibration knocked the delicate electronics out of alignment. Suddenly, the Bismarck was blind ahead. Lütjens could no longer detect ships in front of him through the weather. He was forced to order the Prinz Eugen, which had fully functional radar, to move ahead of the Bismarck and take the lead position in the column. This change in formation would prove critical in the battles to come. For the next several hours, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse played out in the twilight of the Arctic night. At this latitude in May, total darkness never truly fell, leaving a grey half-light that played tricks on the eyes. The Suffolk took station on the German starboard quarter, and the Norfolk took the port quarter. They trailed the German ships, zigzagging to avoid U-boats, constantly dipping in and out of the fog banks. The tension in the radar room of the Suffolk was immense. The operators stared at the cathode ray tubes, watching the blips that represented the most powerful battleship in Europe. If they lost contact, the Bismarck could vanish into the open Atlantic and the convoy routes would be slaughtered. If they got too close, they would be blown out of the water. Captain Ellis maneuvered his ship with precision, keeping the range between 10 and 15 miles. Every change in course and speed made by Lütjens was relayed by the cruisers to the Admiralty and to Admiral Tovey. Deep in the Atlantic, Vice Admiral Holland aboard the HMS Hood received these updates. He plotted an intercept course. Holland commanded the finest ship in the Royal Navy. The Hood was the pride of the fleet, a symbol of British naval power for over 2 decades. Steaming alongside her was the HMS Prince of Wales, a King George V-class battleship so new that civilian contractors were still on board working on her gun turrets. Holland calculated that if the Germans maintained their course and speed, he could intercept them at dawn near the exit of the Denmark Strait. He ordered his ships to increase speed to 27 knots. The spray froze on the decks of the British capital ships as they ploughed through the heavy seas, closing the gap. Back in the Strait, the shadowing continued. The German crews remained at battle stations. Lütjens knew he could not shake the cruisers in the confined waters. He hoped to lure them south, into the open ocean where he could turn and destroy them, or where U-boats might be waiting. But for now, he had to endure the constant presence of the British shadows. The situational awareness provided by the Suffolk and Norfolk was the deciding factor in these early hours. Without the Suffolk's radar, Lütjens almost certainly would have slipped through the net. Instead, every mile of his progress was being plotted on British charts. The leak from Sweden and the shadowing in the Strait had stripped away the element of surprise. The stage was set for a confrontation of titans. As the hours ticked toward the morning of May 24th, the 4 greatest warships of the era were hurtling toward a single point on the ocean, destined to meet in the freezing mist at the edge of the ice pack. Part 2. The Battle of the Denmark Strait. On the morning of May 24, 1941, the waters at the southern exit of the Denmark Strait were calm but shrouded in a cold, grey half-light. The German squadron, consisting of the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen leading the battleship Bismarck, was steering a southwesterly course. They were attempting to break into the open Atlantic. Unknown to the German crews, a British intercept force was closing in on a collision course from the southeast. This force was led by Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland aboard the battlecruiser HMS Hood, accompanied by the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales. Vice Admiral Holland faced a difficult tactical calculation. He knew the Hood was the largest ship in the Royal Navy and possessed massive firepower, equal to that of the Bismarck. However, the Hood was an older design, launched in 1918. Her deck armor was relatively thin, making her vulnerable to plunging fire shells fired from a long distance that arc high into the air and come down almost vertically. To negate this weakness, Holland needed to close the distance to the enemy as rapidly as possible. At shorter ranges, the trajectory of the German shells would be flatter, striking the Hood's thick side armor belt rather than her vulnerable decks. Holland ordered his ships to approach the Germans almost head-on. While this closed the range quickly, it introduced a significant disadvantage. By steaming directly at the enemy, the British ships could only fire their forward gun turrets. The rear turrets were blocked by the ship's own superstructures. This effectively halved their firepower during the critical approach phase. In contrast, the German ships, steering a steady course, could bring all their guns to bear on the approaching British vessels. At 5:37 in the morning, the British squadron made visual contact. The German ships were 17 miles away, visible as dark shapes against the ice-white horizon. On the bridge of the Hood, a critical identification error occurred. Because of the radar failure on the Bismarck the previous day, Admiral Lütjens had ordered the Prinz Eugen to take the lead position. The silhouettes of the two German ships were remarkably similar at a distance. Both had similar turret layouts and superstructures. Holland assumed the lead ship was the Bismarck and signalled his squadron to target the leader. The gunnery officers on the Prince of Wales realized the mistake correctly, identifying the second ship as the larger battleship, but they did not break radio silence to correct the admiral. As a result, when the order to open fire was given, the Hood targeted the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, while the Prince of Wales disregarded the order and targeted the Bismarck. At 5:52 in the morning, the Battle of the Denmark Strait began. The Hood opened fire first, followed instantly by the Prince of Wales. Enormous columns of water erupted around the Prinz Eugen as the British shells fell. On the German side, the reaction was disciplined but tense. Admiral Lütjens, mindful of his orders to avoid engagements with capital ships, hesitated to return fire. The German gunnery officers had locked their rangefinders on the British ships and were screaming for permission to shoot. As British shells began to straddle the German formation, Captain Ernst Lindemann, commanding the Bismarck, intervened. He reportedly muttered that he would not let his ship be shot out from under his ass and requested permission to open fire. Lütjens gave the nod. The German response was immediate and terrifyingly accurate. Both German ships concentrated their fire on the lead British ship, the HMS Hood. The Prinz Eugen scored the first hit. An 8-inch high-explosive shell struck the Hood near the mainmast. This hit ignited the ready-use ammunition lockers for the anti-aircraft guns and the unrotated projectile rocket launchers. A fierce fire erupted on the boat deck of the battlecruiser, spreading rapidly and sending thick black smoke billowing into the air. While the fire on the deck was visually dramatic, it was not immediately fatal. However, it illuminated the Hood perfectly for the German gunners. The range was dropping rapidly, now down to roughly 14 miles. Holland, sensing that the range was now sufficient to avoid plunging fire, ordered a turn of 20 degrees to port. This maneuver was intended to unmask his rear turrets, allowing the full broadside of the Hood and the Prince of Wales to be brought to bear on the enemy. As the Hood began her turn, presenting her full profile to the enemy, the Bismarck fired her fifth salvo. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. Observers on the Prince of Wales, watching their flagship, saw a geyser of flame erupt from near the Hood's mainmast. It was not a normal shell hit. A 15-inch shell from the Bismarck had likely penetrated the thin deck armor, smashed through the intervening decks, and detonated inside the aft 14-inch magazine. The explosion was cataclysmic. A pillar of fire shot 1,000 feet into the air. The massive ship, displacing 42,000 tons, was broken in two. The entire aft section was blown apart, and the forward section was lifted violently out of the water. The violence of the event was such that the concussion knocked men off their feet on the bridge of the Prince of Wales, half a mile away. The pride of the Royal Navy, the symbol of British sea power for 20 years, was destroyed in seconds. The bow section rose vertically out of the water, the forward turrets firing one last defiant salvo from their electrical circuits before slipping beneath the waves. Within 3 minutes, the HMS Hood was gone. From a crew of 1,418 men, only 3 survived. Signalman Ted Briggs, midshipman Bill Dundas, and able seaman Bob Tilburn. They were left floating in the freezing oil-slicked water, surrounded by small pieces of debris that were all that remained of the mighty battlecruiser. The sudden destruction of the Hood left the HMS Prince of Wales in a perilous position. She was now the sole target of both German ships. To make matters worse, she had to swerve sharply to starboard to avoid colliding with the wreckage of the Hood. As she emerged from the smoke of the explosion, she was hit repeatedly. The Prince of Wales was a brand new ship, and she was suffering from severe teething troubles. Civilian contractors from the Vickers Armstrong Company were still on board attempting to fix the hydraulic systems of the gun turrets. During the engagement, the complex mechanical feed systems for the main guns began to fail. At one point, only 2 of her 10 heavy guns were operational. A shell from the Bismarck struck the bridge of the Prince of Wales, passing through without exploding but killing almost everyone in the compass platform. Captain John Leach was one of the few survivors of the blast. Realizing his ship was malfunctioning, taking heavy fire, and facing 2 fully operational German warships, Captain Leach made the decision to break off the action. He ordered a smokescreen and turned away, retreating to the southeast. On the bridge of the Bismarck, the atmosphere was electric. They had just achieved the impossible, destroying the famous HMS Hood and forcing a new British battleship to flee. Captain Lindeman saw an opportunity. The Prince of Wales was damaged and retreating. He wanted to pursue her and finish her off. This would have handed the German Navy a double victory of unprecedented scale. However, Admiral Lütjens intervened. His orders from the High Command were explicit. The primary mission was to sink merchant shipping in the Atlantic. He was to strictly avoid risking the Bismarck in unnecessary duels with enemy warships. To pursue the Prince of Wales would mean reversing course, moving back toward the British fleet and potentially facing more reinforcements. Lütjens overruled Lindeman. The Bismarck would continue her course into the Atlantic. The disagreement on the bridge was reportedly heated, but the admiral's rank prevailed. While the Germans appeared to have won a decisive tactical victory, the Prince of Wales had not fled without biting back. During the brief exchange, the British battleship had scored 3 hits on the Bismarck. 2 of these were relatively minor, causing damage to a launch and the generator room. The 3rd hit, however, was critical. A 14-inch shell had struck the Bismarck amidships, below the waterline. It passed through several compartments before lodging in the ship's structure, but the shockwave and the entry hole caused significant damage. The shell ruptured the primary fuel oil tank and severed the suction lines used to transfer fuel from the forward tanks to the engines. The consequences were immediate and severe. First, the Bismarck lost access to over 1,000 tons of fuel oil stored in the forward tanks. Second, the rupture allowed seawater to flood into the fuel tanks and adjacent voids. The ship began to settle by the bow and list 9 degrees to port. The extra weight of the water in the bow forced the Bismarck to reduce speed to 28 knots to prevent the propellers from coming out of the water. Even more concerning for Lütjens was the trail he was leaving behind. The ruptured tank was leaking oil directly into the sea. A broad, shimmering slick of oil now trailed the battleship, a visible marker that aircraft could follow for miles. Lütjens reviewed his situation. His ship was listing, his speed was reduced, and he was hemorrhaging fuel. The mission to hunt convoys in the mid-Atlantic required long endurance and high speed, both of which were now compromised. The element of surprise was completely gone. The British knew exactly where he was, and they would be mobilizing every available asset to avenge the Hood. The Admiral had to make a new, strategic decision. He could return to Norway, retracing his path through the Denmark Strait. This was the shorter route, but the British cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk were still shadowing him, and the home fleet would be waiting to block his return. Alternatively, he could head for the French coast. The port of Saint-Nazaire possessed a dry dock large enough to accommodate the Bismarck. Heading to France was a longer journey and would take him further into the Atlantic, but once he neared the coast, he could expect protection from U-boats and the Luftwaffe. Lütjens chose France. He ordered the course changed to the south. He also decided that the Prinz-Eugen, which was undamaged, should not be tethered to the crippled battleship. Later that day, he ordered the cruiser to detach and pursue the commerce raiding mission alone. The Bismarck would proceed to Saint-Nazaire for repairs. The Battle of the Denmark Strait was over. In less than 20 minutes, the strategic picture of the naval war had shifted violently. The Royal Navy had lost its most beloved ship and over 1,400 men. The German Navy had won a tactical triumph, but had suffered a strategic wound that doomed their flagship's mission. The Bismarck was no longer the hunter. She was the hunted. She was bleeding oil, down by the bow and limping south. Behind her, the entire might of the Royal Navy was waking up to the news of the Hood's destruction. The shock turned instantly to a cold, hard resolve. The order went out from the Admiralty in London, echoing across the fleet. "Sink the Bismarck." Part 3. Lost in the Atlantic. The shock of the loss of the HMS Hood reverberated instantly through the Royal Navy. In London, the mood in the Admiralty citadel shifted from anxiety to a cold, hard determination. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, issued the famous directive, "Sink the Bismarck." This was no longer just a strategic necessity to protect convoys, it was a matter of national prestige and vengeance. However, in the North Atlantic, emotions had to be suppressed in favor of fuel calculations and course plots. Admiral John Tovey, aboard the flagship HMS King George V, was now leading the chase. He was roughly 300 miles away to the southeast when the Hood went down. He had his own battleship, the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. Upon hearing the news, Tovey ordered his stokers to push the engines to their absolute limits. The British capital ships began burning fuel at an alarming rate, vibrating violently as they smashed through the Atlantic swells, trying to close the gap with the German fugitive. Ahead of Tovey, the situation was fluid. The cruisers, HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk, along with the damaged HMS Prince of Wales, were still shadowing the Bismarck. They were the only link the British fleet had to their target. If they lost radar contact, the Bismarck, which was faster than Tovey's battleships, would almost certainly escape. On the bridge of the Bismarck, Admiral Lütjens was planning his next move. He knew he could not shake his pursuers by speed alone, especially with the ship taking on water and listing to port. The damage from the Prince of Wales had reduced his top speed. Lütjens decided to split his forces. The heavy cruiser Prinz-Eugen was undamaged and fully fueled. There was no reason for her to be tethered to the limping battleship. In the late afternoon of May 24th, the Bismarck entered a fog bank. Lütjens signaled the Prinz-Eugen to detach. As the cruiser sped away to the south to continue her mission independently, the Bismarck turned suddenly to starboard, heading directly toward her pursuers. It was an aggressive maneuver designed to force the shadowing British ships to take evasive action and break radar contact. The Prince of Wales and the cruisers exchanged fire with the Bismarck briefly and turned away to avoid the engagement. By the time the British ships resumed their course, the Prinz-Eugen was gone, and the Bismarck had resumed her journey toward France alone. For the British radar operators on the Suffolk, the stress was becoming unmanageable. They had been glued to their scopes for over 30 hours without rest. Captain Ellis of the Suffolk had been maneuvering his ship in a zigzag pattern to avoid potential U-boat attacks while maintaining radar contact. This meant that at the outer edges of the zigzag, the Bismarck was at the very limit of the radar's range. At 3 o'clock in the morning on May 25th, the fatigue and the physics of the radar waves conspired against the British. The Suffolk was on the outward leg of her zigzag maneuver. When she turned back to sweep the horizon, the green blip on the screen was gone. The Bismarck had slipped out of range. Panic ensued on the British bridge. The Suffolk increased speed and frantically swept the area, but the ocean was empty. The message was flashed to Admiral Tovey and the Admiralty: contact lost. The Atlantic Ocean covers millions of square miles. Without a precise location, the Bismarck was effectively a needle in a haystack. The British fleet was now steaming blind. Admiral Tovey had to make a guess. Had Lütjens doubled back to return to the North Sea, or was he continuing south to France? Ironically, the Germans were unaware that they had successfully escaped. On board the Bismarck, the radar detection equipment was picking up strong signals. Admiral Lütjens believed that the British radar was far more advanced than it actually was. He was convinced that the enemy fleet still had him locked on, even though the British ships were actually far over the horizon. Believing that radio silence was now pointless, since the enemy knew where he was, Lütjens made a fatal error. At roughly 9 o'clock in the morning on May 25th, Lütjens authorized the transmission of a long radio message to the German High Command. It was a 30-minute report detailing the sinking of the Hood, the damage to the Bismarck, and the state of his fuel. British listening stations in the United Kingdom and Iceland immediately intercepted the powerful signal. They could not read the content of the encrypted message, but they could use high-frequency direction finding, known as HUF-DUF, to triangulate the source. Lines of bearing were plotted on charts in the Admiralty plotting room. The intersection of these lines pinpointed the Bismarck's position. The British had been handed a second chance on a silver platter. However, in the chaos of the moment, a catastrophic calculation error occurred aboard Admiral Tovey's flagship. The plotting officer on the King George V was working with mnemonic charts, which are used for great circle navigation. When he transferred the bearings from the shore stations onto the ship's navigational charts, he failed to account correctly for the curvature of the Earth relative to the ship's current position. The result was a mathematical disaster. The plotted position suggested that the Bismarck was not heading southeast to France, but northeast, back toward the Norway-Iceland gap. Tovey stared at the chart. It seemed to indicate that Lütjens was trying to return home. Trusting his navigation officer, Tovey ordered the entire home fleet to change course. The British battleships swung their bows to the northeast, powering away toward the North Sea. In reality, the Bismarck was roughly 100 miles to the south, steaming steadily toward the safety of the French coast. For the next 7 hours, the British fleet and the German battleship were moving in opposite directions. The gap between them widened with every passing mile. It was not until late afternoon that the Admiralty in London realized the mistake. They had been plotting the bearings correctly and could not understand why Tovey was heading toward Norway. A frantic signal was sent from London to the King George V. Calculation incorrect. Enemy heading for France. Tovey was horrified. He had wasted precious hours and tons of irreplaceable fuel chasing a phantom. He immediately ordered the fleet to turn around, but the damage was done. The Bismarck had gained a massive lead. The mathematics of the pursuit were now grim. The King George V was low on fuel. The Prince of Wales was even lower. Unless the Bismarck slowed down, the British ships would not catch her before she reached the umbrella of German air cover from the Luftwaffe bases in France. A gloom settled over the British commanders. They had found her, fought her, lost her, found her again via radio, and then sailed away from her. It seemed that the Bismarck was destined to escape. By the morning of May 26th, the sea was empty, the sky was grey, and the British destroyers were detaching one by one to refuel. Tovey was beginning to draft the signals explaining the failure of the mission. The only hope remaining lay with Coastal Command. The Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force had launched every available long-range patrol aircraft to scour the approaches to France. Among them were American-built Catalina flying boats, aircraft capable of staying airborne for 24 hours. One of these Catalinas, call sign Z for Zebra, was piloted by Flight Lieutenant Dennis Briggs. However, sitting in the co-pilot seat was a unique figure in this drama, Ensign Leonard Smith of the United States Navy. The United States was not yet officially at war with Germany. Pearl Harbor was still 6 months away. Smith was officially a special observer, ostensibly there to learn about British anti-submarine tactics. In reality, he was flying an operational war mission. At 10:30 in the morning on May 26, the Catalina was patrolling roughly 700 miles west of the French coast. The weather was turbulent, with low cloud cover and rough seas. Through a break in the mist, Ensign Smith looked down at the water. He saw a dark shape ploughing through the waves. It was not a merchant ship. It was a massive warship, leaving a trail of oil. Smith alerted Briggs. They maneuvered the clumsy flying boat for a closer look. As they dropped out of the cloud base, the ship below erupted in anti-aircraft fire. Flak burst around the slow-moving plane, shaking the airframe. Smith and Briggs had their confirmation. No British ship would fire on a Catalina. Smith transmitted the sighting report that would seal the fate of the operation. One battleship, bearing 240, distance 5 miles, course 150, my position 49 to 33, north 21 to 47 west. The location was shocking to the British Admiralty. The Bismarck was much further south than they had feared. She was approximately 690 miles from Brest, France. At her current speed, she would be within range of German air protection by the following morning. Admiral Tovey reviewed the position on his chart. His main battle fleet, the King George V and the Rodney, were 130 miles behind the Bismarck. They simply could not catch up. The mathematics of speed and distance were absolute. Unless something slowed the German battleship down, she would reach safety within 24 hours. The hunt had transitioned from a search to a desperate race against time. Tovey knew that his heavy guns were useless if he could not bring them into range. The only unit in the Royal Navy that was positioned to intercept the Bismarck was Force H, a task force steaming north from Gibraltar under Admiral James Somerville. But Force H did not have battleships capable of standing toe-to-toe with the Bismarck. Its main capital ship was the HMS Renown, a battlecruiser with thin armour that would likely suffer the same fate as the Hood. However, Force H possessed one asset that changed the equation, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. As the Catalina turned for home, low on fuel, the coordinates of the Bismarck were relayed to the Ark Royal. The carrier turned her bow into the wind. The Bismarck was spotted, but she was not yet caught. The final act of the drama would not be decided by the massive 15-inch guns of the battleships, but by fragile biplanes made of canvas and wire. The responsibility for stopping the most powerful warship in the world now rested on the shoulders of a few dozen naval aviators. Part 4. The Swordfish Strike. By the afternoon of May 26, 1941, the hunt for the Bismarck had devolved into a mathematical impossibility for the main British pursuit force. Admiral John Tovey, aboard the HMS King George V, was too far behind. The German battleship was steaming steadily toward the coast of France. Within a matter of hours, she would fall under the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe. Once German bombers and fighters could operate over the Bismarck, the Royal Navy would be forced to withdraw, and the raider would be safe in the dry docks of Saint-Nazaire. The only remaining obstacle between the Bismarck and safety was Force H. This task force had been dispatched from Gibraltar under the command of Admiral James Somerville. Unlike the heavy battleships of the home fleet, Force H was built around speed and air power. Its core consisted of the battlecruiser HMS Renown, the light cruiser HMS Sheffield, and, most importantly, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. However, the presence of Force H was not a guarantee of success. The Renown, while fast and armed with 15-inch guns, was an older ship with light armour. In a direct gunfight, the Bismarck would likely destroy her just as easily as she had destroyed the Hood. Therefore, the burden of the entire operation fell upon the air group of the HMS Ark Royal. The weather conditions on May 26th were atrocious. A severe Atlantic gale was blowing from the northwest, whipping the sea into a frenzy. The waves were 40 to 50 feet high, causing the deck of the Ark Royal to pitch and roll violently. Launching aircraft in such conditions was extremely hazardous. The stern of the carrier rose and fell through an arc of nearly 60 feet, threatening to smash the delicate landing gear of any aircraft attempting to take off or land. Despite these conditions, Admiral Somerville knew he had no choice. At 2:50 p.m., the first strike force was launched. 15 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers clawed their way into the air. These aircraft were anachronisms in a modern war. They were biplanes constructed of steel tubes covered in fabric, with open cockpits and fixed landing gear. Their top speed with a torpedo was barely 90 miles per hour. Yet, in the rough seas and low visibility of the North Atlantic, their slow speed and rugged handling would prove to be unexpected assets. The pilots of this first wave were briefed that the Bismarck was the only ship in the designated target area. They flew through thick clouds and driving rain, relying on their radar sets to locate the enemy. Roughly 1 hour after launch, the radar operators picked up a large contact. The squadron leader signaled the attack. The Swordfish dived through the cloud layer, visually acquired a warship below, and leveled off for their torpedo runs. Disaster was narrowly averted only by the sharp eyes of the pilots and the frantic maneuvering of the ship below. The ship they were attacking was not the Bismarck, it was the HMS Sheffield. The cruiser Sheffield had been ordered to detach from Force H and speed ahead to shadow the Bismarck, a movement that the air crews on the Ark Royal had not been informed of. The pilots, seeing a ship in the expected location, assumed it was the enemy. They dropped 11 torpedoes. The Sheffield turned hard at full speed to evade the weapons. In a stroke of immense fortune for the British, the torpedoes used in this attack were fitted with magnetic detonators. These experimental fuses were designed to explode when they detected the magnetic field of a ship's steel hull passing overhead. However, the technology was faulty. The heavy seas and the impact of hitting the water caused many of the torpedoes to detonate prematurely, exploding harmlessly in the waves before they even reached the Sheffield. Other torpedoes were successfully combed by the cruiser's captain, Charles Larcom, who threaded his ship between the tracks. Realizing their mistake, the squadron leader called off the attack. The Swordfish climbed back into the clouds and returned to the Ark Royal. The pilots landed in disgrace, shaken by the realization that they had nearly sunk one of their own ships. However, this failure provided a critical piece of data. The magnetic detonators were unreliable. For the next attempt, the armorers on the Ark Royal were ordered to switch to contact detonators, which would only explode upon physically striking the hull of the target. As the ground crews frantically rearmed and refueled the aircraft, the daylight began to fade. The weather worsened. The gale intensified, and the cloud ceiling dropped to 700 feet. The coming night brought a sense of finality. If the Bismarck was not slowed down before dawn, she would be saved. At 7:10 p.m., the second strike wave was ready. 15 Swordfish from 825 Naval Air Squadron were ranged on the heaving flight deck. The strike was led by Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode. The sheer physical difficulty of the operation was immense. The deck crew had to time the movement of the aircraft with the roll of the ship to prevent them from sliding into the sea. As the carrier turned into the wind, the pilots revved their engines, struggling against the gale. One by one, the 15 biplanes lumbered down the deck and lifted into the grey, rain-swept sky. They formed up in subflights and turned south, guided by the signals from the Sheffield, which was still shadowing the Bismarck 12 miles ahead. The flight to the target took over an hour. The open cockpits exposed the crews to freezing rain and hail. At 8:55 p.m., the Swordfish located the Sheffield, which signaled the direction of the enemy. Minutes later, the pilots saw the dark, formidable shape of the Bismarck breaking through the mist. The German battleship was ready. Her crew had been at battle stations for days, fueled by adrenaline and methamphetamines. As the Swordfish descended from the clouds, the Bismarck erupted in a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. The sky was filled with the black bursts of heavy flak and the traces of lighter automatic weapons. The German batteries were some of the most advanced in the world, directed by stabilized fire control computers. However, the technological sophistication of the Bismarck worked against her. The German fire control computers were designed to track modern, high-speed monoplanes. They calculated the necessary deflection, the distance to aim ahead of a moving target, based on aircraft speeds of 200 to 300 miles per hour. The Swordfish were flying into a 40-knot headwind. Their ground speed was barely 60 knots. They were effectively hovering. The German computers consistently overestimated the lead, causing the majority of the shells to explode harmlessly in front of the attacking biplanes. The Swordfish pressed the attack with suicidal courage. They approached the battleship from multiple angles to split the defensive fire. The aircraft bounced violently in the turbulence of the exploding shells. One pilot, Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat, found himself skimming just above the wavetops on the port side of the Bismarck. He held his course, waiting for the optimal drop angle. When the massive silhouette of the battleship filled his windscreen, he released his torpedo and banked sharply away, climbing desperately to escape the wall of steel flying toward him. The strike force dropped a total of 13 torpedoes. Most missed or were evaded by the skilled maneuvering of Captain Lindemann. One torpedo struck the Bismarck amidships on the heavy side armor belt. It exploded with a dull thud but failed to penetrate the massive hardened steel plate. The damage was negligible. But another torpedo found a more vulnerable mark. It struck the Bismarck on the stern, on the port side. The warhead detonated against the hull, not protected by the main armor belt. The explosion was devastating. It tore a hole in the ship's structure and flooded the steering gear compartment. The force of the blast violently whipped the massive rudders over. The shockwave buckled the steel coupling of the port rudder assembly, jamming it tight at a 12-degree angle to port. Inside the Bismarck, the steering gear room became a death trap. The explosion caused the safety valves to fail and the compartment flooded rapidly. The machinery was mangled and twisted. The crew attempted to regain control, but the rudders were immovable. On the bridge, Captain Lindemann tried to counter the jammed rudder by using the engines. He ordered the starboard screws to run at full speed and the port screws to reverse, attempting to use differential thrust to force the ship back onto a straight course. It was futile. The pressure of the water against the jammed rudders was too great. The Bismarck began to turn in a slow, inexorable circle. She turned out of the wind. She turned away from the safety of France. The mighty battleship, capable of destroying any vessel in the world in a fair fight, was now spiraling northwest, directly toward the pursuing British fleet. Aboard the Ark Royal, the returning pilots were unsure of their success. They had seen explosions, but the weather made damage assessment impossible. 5 of the Swordfish had been damaged by gunfire, with fabric torn and struts severed, but miraculously, all 15 aircraft returned safely to the carrier. It was a testament to the ruggedness of the string bag and the skill of the aviators. The confirmation of the hit came from the Sheffield. The cruiser reported that the Bismarck had made a sudden loop and was now steering a chaotic course. Then, the realization set in. The German ship slowed down. She was no longer running. She was wallowing in the heavy seas. On the Bismarck, the situation was desperate. Admiral Lütjens sent divers down into the flooded steering compartment to see if the rudder could be uncoupled or blown off with explosives. The water pressure and the violent motion of the ship in the storm made the task impossible. The divers were battered against the steel walls and could not work. A proposal to weld a hangar door to the side of the ship to act as a makeshift rudder was dismissed as impractical in the gale force conditions. Lütjens knew it was over. The ship was unmaneuverable. She could not hold a course to reach the air cover of the Luftwaffe. She could only steam in circles or head slowly into the wind, which took her directly toward the enemy. At 9:40 p.m., Admiral Lütjens sent a bleak signal to Berlin. "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." For the British, the news of the jammed rudder was the deliverance they had prayed for. Admiral Tovey, aboard the King George V, received the report. The chase was over. He no longer had to worry about fuel or speed. The Bismarck was effectively tethered, waiting for him. Tovey ordered his battleships, the King George V and the Rodney, to approach from the west. He wanted to wait for daylight. There was no need to risk a chaotic night engagement when the enemy was trapped. He would use the darkness to surround the Bismarck, rest his crews, and prepare for the final execution in the morning. However, he did not leave the Bismarck in peace. He ordered Captain Philip Vian, commanding the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, to shadow and harass the German ship throughout the night. Vian's destroyers, HMS Cossack, Sikh, Maori, Zulu, and the Polish destroyer Purin, charged into the storm. For the sailors on the Bismarck, the night of May 26th was a prelude to the end. The ship was rolling heavily in the trough of the waves. The constant alarm bells, the harassing attacks by the destroyers, and the knowledge that the steering was gone destroyed morale. They had been so close to safety. Now, they were drifting alone in the Atlantic night, listening to the sound of the British fleet gathering in the darkness, waiting for the sun to rise. The Swordfish, the slow, canvas-covered biplanes, had delivered the fatal blow that the great battleships could not. The pride of the German Navy was a sitting duck. Part 5. The Final Battle. The night of May 26, 1941, was a long agony for the crew of the Bismarck. The ship was trapped in a chaotic circle, her rudders jammed, wallowing in a heavy northwest gale. She was unable to steer a course for France, and she was unable to turn her bow to face the enemy properly. While the main British battle fleet waited for dawn to deliver the final blow, Admiral Tovey ordered the 4th Destroyer Flotilla to keep the pressure on the German giant. Commanded by Captain Philip Vian aboard the HMS Cossack, the flotilla consisted of the destroyers Cossack, Sikh, Maori, Zulu, and the Polish destroyer Piorun. Throughout the night, these small ships displayed remarkable aggression. They used the cover of darkness and the violent sea state to dash in close to the Bismarck, launch torpedoes, and retreat before the German heavy guns could find their range. The engagement was particularly personal for the crew of the Piorun. Commander Eugeniusz Piorski brought his ship dangerously close to the battleship, engaging the 50,000-ton behemoth with his small 4.7-inch guns. While the destroyer's fire could do little damage to the Bismarck's armor, the constant harassment served a vital tactical purpose. It kept the German crew at battle stations. They were exhausted, mentally drained, and suffering from the sinking morale of a ship that knows it is doomed. Admiral Lütjens requested a U-boat to retrieve the ship's war diary, but no submarine was close enough. The Bismarck was alone. As the sun rose on the morning of May 27th, the weather remained severe. The sky was a sheet of grey, and the wind was blowing at force 8. Visibility was roughly 10 to 12 miles. Admiral Tovey, aboard the HMS King George V, approached from the west. He was accompanied by the HMS Rodney, an older battleship but one armed with massive 16-inch guns, the largest caliber in the Royal Navy. Tovey's plan was simple. He would close the range and use the superior firepower of his 2 battleships to silence the Bismarck. He signalled his intentions to the Rodney: engage the enemy. At 8:47 in the morning, the HMS Rodney opened fire from a range of 12 miles. 1 minute later, the King George V joined in. The Bismarck returned fire almost immediately. For a brief moment, it appeared the German gunnery might still be dangerous. The first salvos from the Bismarck straddled the Rodney, splashing water onto her decks. However, the German ship was handicapped. Because she was steering in erratic circles due to the jammed rudder, her gunnery computer could not calculate a stable firing solution. Additionally, the list to port affected the elevation of her guns. The British fire was relentless. At 8:54, a 16-inch shell from the Rodney struck the Bismarck's forward superstructure. This hit was likely the decisive moment of the final battle. It destroyed the forward gunnery control post and killed most of the senior officers on the bridge, likely including Admiral Lütjens and Captain Lindemann. With the central fire control system destroyed, the Bismarck's 4 main turrets, Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, were forced to fire independently using local optical sights. Their accuracy plummeted. Minutes later, another heavy shell struck the turret designated Bruno, the 2nd turret from the bow. The explosion blew the back of the turret off and ignited the propellant charges inside. The massive guns were permanently silenced. The Bismarck was being systematically dismantled. By 9 o'clock, the 2 British battleships had closed the range to less than 5 miles. This was point-blank range for heavy naval artillery. The HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire, the heavy cruisers that had followed the chase for so long, joined the firing circle, pouring 8-inch shells into the burning superstructure. The Bismarck was now a wreck. Her mast had been shot away, her funnel was riddled with holes, and fires raged from bow to stern. Yet her main armor belt held. The ship refused to sink. The British battleships continued to pound her. The HMS Rodney moved in so close, roughly 2 miles away, that she fired torpedoes at the Bismarck. This was the only recorded instance in history of one battleship torpedoing another. Inside the Bismarck, the conditions were horrific. The internal communications were cut, the lights were out, and the air was filled with smoke and the fumes of cordite. Survivors later described the ship as a fiery labyrinth. Yet, the German flag still flew. The ship had not surrendered. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Admiral Tovey faced a critical problem. The King George V and the Rodney were dangerously low on fuel. They had been steaming at high speed for days. Tovey could not afford to stay on station any longer, or his ships would be unable to reach port. The Bismarck was a flaming ruin, her guns silent, but she was still floating. Tovey ordered the battleships to break off the action and head home. As he turned away, he signaled to the remaining ships, "Any ship with torpedoes remaining, close and sink her." The task fell to the heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire. Captain Benjamin Martin steered his ship toward the starboard side of the listing Bismarck. At 10:25, he fired 2 torpedoes, both struck the hull. Martin then maneuvered around to the port side and fired a 3rd torpedo. This final blow struck amidships. Simultaneously, deep within the bowels of the Bismarck, the final German command was being executed. Commander Gerhard Junak, the chief engineering officer, had prepared scuffling charges in the engine room intakes. With the order given to abandon ship, the charges were detonated and the cooling water intakes were opened. The sea rushed into the hull. The combination of the torpedo hits and the scuffling charges broke the ship's resistance. The Bismarck rolled slowly over to port. Her keel rose out of the water and the massive turrets fell out of their mountings, plunging into the abyss. At 10:39 in the morning, on May 27, 1941, the Bismarck disappeared beneath the waves of the Atlantic, roughly 300 miles west of Ushant, France. The surface of the ocean was covered in a thick layer of fuel oil and debris. Hundreds of German sailors were bobbing in the freezing water, calling for help. The HMS Dorsetshire and the destroyer HMS Maori moved in to commence rescue operations. Ropes were thrown over the sides, and British sailors hauled the exhausted Germans up the steep steel hulls. The rescue effort proceeded for some time. The British crews managed to pull 85 men onto the Dorsetshire and 25 onto the Maori. However, the shadow of the U-boat war loomed over the scene. At 11:40, a lookout on the Dorsetshire reported sighting a periscope or a smoke trail that suggested a submarine was nearby. Captain Martin had to make an agonizing decision. His ship was stationary, an easy target for a U-boat torpedo. He could not risk the lives of his crew and the safety of his ship. He ordered the rescue lines cut and the engines to full ahead. The Dorsetshire and Maori surged away, leaving hundreds of survivors still in the water. It is likely there was no U-boat in the immediate attack position, but in the paranoia of the Atlantic War, the risk was considered too high. Later that evening, the German submarine U-74 arrived at the scene and rescued 3 men from a raft. The next day, a German weather ship, the Sachsenwald, picked up another 2. Out of a crew of over 2,200 men, only 115 survived the sinking of the Bismarck. The news of the sinking reached London shortly after 11 o'clock. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was in the House of Commons. He interrupted the business of the day to announce, "I have just received news that the Bismarck is sunk." The House erupted in cheers. The vengeance for the Hood was complete. The destruction of the Bismarck marked a definitive turning point in the war at sea. It was the last time the German Navy attempted to send a battleship into the North Atlantic to disrupt Allied convoys. The sister ship of the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, spent the rest of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, serving as a fleet in being that tied up British resources but never fought a ship-to-ship action in the open ocean. The German surface threat had been neutralized. The Battle of the Atlantic would henceforth be fought almost exclusively by U-boats. The operation also signaled a shift in the hierarchy of naval power. The Bismarck was a triumph of armor and gunnery, a traditional battleship designed to dominate other surface ships. Yet, she was not defeated by a stronger battleship. She was crippled by a slow, fragile biplane launching a torpedo. The hit to the rudder by the Swordfish from the HMS Ark Royal demonstrated that the era of the invincible battleship was over. Air power had become the deciding factor in naval warfare. No amount of steel armor could protect a ship's steering gear from a lucky torpedo dropped from the clouds. The hunt was a saga of errors, luck, and endurance. The British made critical mistakes: Admiral Holland's angle of approach at the Denmark Strait, the tracking failure on the Suffolk, and Admiral Tovey's calculation error that sent the fleet toward Norway. The Germans made mistakes too: Lütjens's failure to refuel in Norway, the decision to transmit a radio message when he was safe, and the fatal design flaw that left the Bismarck's stern vulnerable. In the end, the story of the Bismarck is a human tragedy of immense scale. Over 3,500 sailors, British and German, died in the span of 4 days between the sinking of the Hood and the sinking of the Bismarck. It remains one of the most compelling narratives of the Second World War, a moment when the technology of the past met the technology of the future in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. The great steel giant was gone, and the convoys continued to sail. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.